The cold-hearted millionaire had never shown emotion to anyone until he saw two little twin girls with the exact same emerald eyes as his deceased first love. What happened next shocked everyone. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The December rain hammered against the windows of Marcus Wellington's penthouse office like bullets against bulletproof glass. At 38, he had built an empire that most men could only dream of. But tonight, as he stared down at the glittering lights of Manhattan 60 floors below, something felt different, empty, cold. "Mr. Wellington, the Henderson merger documents are ready for your signature." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Not now, Patricia. I'm leaving." Marcus grabbed his charcoal wool coat and headed for the elevator. He couldn't remember the last time he'd left the office before midnight, but something was pulling him toward the streets tonight. Maybe it was the anniversary approaching. Sarah had died exactly 10 years ago tomorrow. The rain had turned to sleet by the time Marcus stepped onto Fifth Avenue. His driver waited by the black Bentley, but Marcus waved him away. He needed to walk, to feel something other than the numbness that had consumed him for a decade. That's when he saw them. Huddled beneath a torn piece of cardboard near the entrance to Central Park were two small figures. As Marcus approached, his breath caught in his throat. Two little girls, no older than 7, with golden blonde hair matted against their pale faces. But it was their eyes that stopped him cold, emerald green exactly like Sarah's. The smaller girl looked up at him with those impossible eyes, and for a moment Marcus felt his carefully constructed walls crumble. She couldn't weigh more than 50 pounds, her thin frame shivering beneath a threadbare pink sweater. "Don't look at him," whispered the other girl, pulling her sister closer. "Mama always said not to trust men in expensive suits." Marcus knelt down slowly, his $2,000 shoes touching the wet pavement. "What are your names?" "I'm Emma, and this is Sophie," the braver twin replied. Her chin lifted defiantly, despite the fear in her eyes. "We don't need help." But Sophie was staring at Marcus with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Her tiny hand reached out, almost touching his face, before Emma pulled it back. "She sees things," Emma whispered protectively. "Things that scare people." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. These children, with their familiar eyes and mysterious words, were about to change everything he thought he knew about himself. "Where are your parents?" Emma's lower lip trembled. They're with the angels now." As Marcus looked into those green eyes that haunted his dreams, he made a decision that would alter the course of 3 lives forever. But what he didn't know was that these 2 small angels carried secrets that would force him to confront the darkest chapter of his past. And Sophie's gift was about to reveal a truth that would shatter everything Marcus believed about the night Sarah died. Marcus's penthouse felt like a museum invaded by life itself. Every minimalist surface, every perfectly placed accent piece seemed to mock the chaotic warmth that 2 small children brought into his sterile sanctuary. Emma sat rigidly on the edge of his white Italian leather sofa, her thin arms wrapped protectively around Sophie, who hadn't spoken a single word since they'd crossed his threshold an hour ago. The contrast was jarring, his world of glass and steel against these 2 fragile beings who looked like they'd stepped out of a Brothers Grimm fairy tale, all golden hair and enormous green eyes that held far too much knowledge for their 7 years. "Are you going to call the police?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible above the hum of the city 60 floors below. Her small hands trembled as she smoothed Sophie's tangled hair, a gesture so protective and maternal that it made Marcus's chest ache. "No," Marcus replied, the word surprising him with its firmness. In his business world, every decision was calculated, measured against risk and return. This felt different. This felt right. I'm going to call someone who can help. Dr. Rebecca Chen arrived within an hour, her familiar presence bringing a sense of normalcy to the surreal evening. As one of the city's top pediatricians and Marcus's closest friend from his rare charitable board involvement, she was one of the few people he trusted completely. Her gentle manner with children had always impressed him, though he'd never imagined he'd need her skills personally. After a thorough examination of both girls in his guest bedroom, she pulled Marcus into his study, closing the door with the practiced discretion of someone accustomed to delicate situations. They're severely malnourished and emotionally exhausted, but physically they're remarkably resilient, Rebecca reported, setting down her medical bag with a soft sigh. Emma has some old scars on her forearms, defensive wounds from protecting herself and her sister. These children have been surviving on the streets for months, Marcus. They've developed survival instincts that no child should need. How long do you think they've been alone? Marcus asked, already dreading the answer. Judging by their condition and the way Emma speaks about taking care of Sophie, I'd estimate 4 to 6 months minimum. Marcus, listen to me carefully. These children need more than just a warm bed and regular meals. They need stability, consistency, and emotional security. They need someone who can commit to healing their trauma, not just housing them temporarily. The weight of her words settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. After Rebecca left with promises to return the next day, Marcus found Sophie standing at his floor-to-ceiling windows, her small palm pressed flat against the cold glass. The city lights reflected in her eyes made them appear almost luminous, otherworldly. She was humming a melody he'd never heard before, yet somehow it resonated in his bones with painful familiarity. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, filled with a melancholy that seemed far beyond her years. "Sophie, come away from there," Emma called gently from across the room, where she'd been examining his bookshelf with curious fingers. "You'll catch cold." But Sophie turned to face Marcus instead, those incredible green eyes seeming to look straight through him to someplace deeper, darker. When she spoke, her voice held an eerie certainty that made his skin crawl. "The lady with the yellow hair visits you in your dreams," she said matter-of-factly, as if commenting on the weather. "She's very sad because you blame yourself for something that wasn't your fault. She wants you to know that she forgives you, but you have to forgive yourself too." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. He'd never told anyone about his dreams of Sarah, about how she appeared to him night after night, with those same green eyes filled with accusations and disappointment. How could this child possibly know about the private hell he'd been living for 10 years? "Sophie doesn't mean to scare people," Emma said quickly, rushing to her sister's side with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd made this apology many times before. "She just sees things that happened, things that are happening somewhere else, sometimes things that might happen. Mama always said it was a gift, but most people think it's weird." That night, as both girls finally slept peacefully in his guest room, Marcus stood in his study, staring at the silver-framed photograph of Sarah that had occupied the same spot on his mahogany desk for 10 years. The woman he'd loved and lost, whose death had transformed him from an ambitious but caring young entrepreneur into the cold, ruthless corporate shark the business world knew today. For the first time in a decade, as he watched the gentle rise and fall of Sophie's breathing through the crack in the guest room door, Marcus wondered if maybe, just maybe, he deserved a second chance at caring about someone again. But Sophie's impossible words echoed in his mind like a prophecy, and he couldn't shake the growing certainty that these children knew far more about his carefully buried past than any stranger should. What other devastating secrets were hidden behind those hauntingly familiar green eyes? 3 days had passed since that life-changing encounter in the rain, and Marcus found himself doing something he'd never imagined possible: shopping for children's clothes in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man who could negotiate billion-dollar mergers while blindfolded was completely overwhelmed by the prospect of choosing appropriate pajamas for 2 7-year-old girls. Emma had been unfailingly polite but emotionally distant, accepting his help with the careful gratitude of someone who'd learned not to expect permanence from adults. She said please and thank you with mechanical precision, but kept her emotional walls firmly in place, ready to protect herself and Sophie from yet another disappointment. Sophie, meanwhile, continued to unnerve him with her uncannily accurate observations, delivered in that matter-of-fact tone that suggested she was simply reporting weather conditions rather than exposing the deepest truths of people's souls. "Mr. Wellington doesn't know how to be happy anymore," she'd announced casually over breakfast that morning, causing Emma to nearly choke on her orange juice and immediately begin apologizing for her sister's bluntness. But Marcus was beginning to understand that Sophie's statements weren't meant as attacks. They were simply truth, delivered without the social filters that most people spent their entire lives developing. In some ways, her honesty was refreshing, even when it cut to the bone. "Call me Marcus," he told them as they stood in the legendary FAO Schwartz toy store, surrounded by wonderlands of childhood dreams that felt foreign to his adult sensibilities. "Mr. Wellington makes me sound like my father, and trust me, that's not a comparison I enjoy. Was your father mean to you?" Emma asked, her carefully constructed guard dropping slightly for the first time since they'd met. The question came out in a rush, as if she'd been wondering about it but hadn't dared to ask. "He wasn't cruel, exactly," Marcus admitted, choosing his words carefully as they walked past displays of dollhouses and train sets. "But he believed that showing emotion was weakness, that successful men couldn't afford the luxury of feelings. He taught me that business always came first, that personal relationships were secondary to building an empire." Emma nodded knowingly, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "Our daddy wasn't mean either, but Mama used to say he had a broken heart that never healed right. That's why he couldn't take care of us after she got sick and went to heaven. He just disappeared one day and never came back." It was the most personal information Emma had shared about their tragic past, and Marcus felt genuinely honored by her trust. The weight of responsibility settled more heavily on his shoulders as he began to understand just how much these children had already lost. As they wandered through the store, Sophie suddenly stopped dead in front of an elaborate display of music boxes, her attention completely captured by one particular piece. It was an antique-style music box with intricate gold filigree and a tiny porcelain ballerina frozen mid-pirouette. "This one," she said with absolute certainty, pointing at the specific music box as if it had called her name. "It needs to come home with us." Marcus lifted the delicate piece and wound the tiny golden key with fingers that had begun to tremble uncontrollably. The familiar melody that filled the air around them was like a ghost from his past, each note a knife to his carefully guarded heart. It was the exact same tune Sophie had been humming at his window that first night, the same melody that had played from the identical music box Sarah had treasured above all her other possessions. "How did you know?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the tinkling notes. Sophie looked up at him with those ancient, knowing eyes that seemed to hold wisdom accumulated over lifetimes rather than years. "She showed me," the child replied simply, as if this explained everything. "The lady with yellow hair who visits your dreams. She wants you to remember all the good times you shared together, not just the sad ending that wasn't anybody's fault." That evening, as Emma patiently helped Sophie prepare for bed in what was becoming a nightly routine, Marcus secluded himself in his study and placed a call to his personal attorney. If he was truly going to do this, if he was going to attempt to become a legal guardian to these extraordinary children, he needed to approach it with the same methodical precision he brought to his business dealings. But as he listened to Sophie winding the music box again from the next room, humming along to Sarah's favorite melody with perfect pitch and inexplicable familiarity, Marcus realized with startling clarity that he wasn't just changing their lives anymore. They were fundamentally transforming his in ways he couldn't yet begin to understand or control. The representatives from the Department of Child Services arrived precisely at 9 o'clock on a grey Tuesday morning, their bureaucratic efficiency serving as a stark and unwelcome reminder that Marcus's newfound sense of family existed entirely at the mercy of government regulations and social worker evaluations. Janet Morrison was a severe woman in her 50s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a tight bun and sharp, calculating eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of his penthouse for future judgment. She carried herself with the rigid authority of someone who had seen too many wealthy men attempt to buy their way out of proper procedures, and her disapproval was practically radiating from her clipboard-clutching posture. "Mr. Wellington, while your charitable intentions may be admirable in theory, these children require proper placement in an approved foster home with qualified caregivers," she stated with the cold precision of someone delivering a business presentation. "This situation, however well-meaning, is highly irregular and potentially harmful to their long-term development. I can provide everything they need and more," Marcus replied, struggling to keep his voice steady and professional despite the rising panic in his chest. "They're safe here. They're being properly cared for. They have access to the best medical care, education, provided by hired help and nannies while you maintain your 18-hour work days." Janet's tone was cutting, designed to expose what she clearly viewed as the fundamental flaw in his reasoning. "Children require emotional stability and consistent nurturing, Mr. Wellington, not just financial security and material comforts. They need parents, not benefactors." Emma and Sophie sat close together on his leather sofa, both girls maintaining careful silence, but watching every exchange with the hyper-vigilant attention of children who had learned that adult conversations often determined their fate. Sophie's small hand found Marcus's as Janet continued her interrogation, and he felt that now familiar jolt of connection and protective instinct. "He's not like the other grown-ups who made promises they didn't keep," Sophie said quietly, her voice carrying that unsettling certainty that had become her trademark. She looked directly at the social worker with those penetrating green eyes. His heart was broken into tiny pieces, so he built walls around all his feelings to keep from hurting more. But Emma and I can see the cracks getting bigger every day, which means the walls are coming down. Janet Morrison paused mid-sentence, clearly taken aback by the child's unusually articulate and perceptive phrasing. "What exactly do you mean by that, sweetheart?" "Someone he loved very much died in an accident, and he blamed himself even though it wasn't his fault," Sophie explained matter-of-factly. "He stopped letting people get close because he was afraid they might die too and make the hurt even worse. But now he's remembering that love is worth the risk of losing it." The social worker's expression softened slightly, though her professional skepticism remained firmly intact. After she left with promises to return for a comprehensive home evaluation and character assessment, Marcus found himself pacing his office like a caged predator, his usual commanding presence reduced to barely contained anxiety. His assistant Patricia watched nervously from her desk as he cancelled crucial meetings and ignored increasingly urgent calls from international clients whose deals required his immediate attention. "Sir, the Tokyo acquisition deadline is tomorrow, and the Singapore merger documents still need your review," she ventured cautiously. "Handle it," Marcus snapped, then immediately caught himself and softened his tone. The last thing these children needed was to witness him reverting to his old harsh persona. "Please, Patricia, just manage everything for the next few weeks. Delegate whatever you can to the senior partners." That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep clutching her new music box, Emma approached Marcus's study with the careful steps of someone who had learned to read adult moods for signs of danger or rejection. "Are they going to take us away from you?" she asked, her voice cracking with a mixture of desperate hope and learned pessimism that broke his heart. Marcus knelt to bring himself to her eye level, looking directly into those familiar green eyes that reminded him so powerfully of Sarah. "I won't let that happen, Emma, I promise you that." "You really promise?" Emma whispered, her small hands twisting the hem of her new nightgown. "Because some grown-ups promise things they don't really mean, and it hurts worse than if they'd just told the truth from the beginning." "I promise," Marcus said, meaning it with every fiber of his being, more than any business contract he'd ever negotiated or any deal he'd ever closed. "We're going to be a family no matter what it takes." But as Emma finally relaxed enough to hug him goodnight, Marcus found himself questioning the true nature of his motivations. Was he fighting this custody battle for their happiness and security, or for his own desperate, selfish need to fill the gaping void that Sarah's death had carved out of his soul 10 years ago? The answer to that question would ultimately determine whether he could truly protect them, or whether his unresolved grief would end up destroying the fragile trust these damaged children had begun to place in him. Marcus hired Catherine Hayes, widely considered the most formidable family attorney in New York, but even her legendary courtroom skills couldn't mask her skepticism about his prospects when they met in her corner office overlooking Central Park. "Your public reputation is going to work against you, Marcus," she said, with characteristic bluntness, spreading his file across her mahogany conference table like evidence in a criminal trial. "The business community knows you as ruthless, calculating, emotionally detached. Family court judges prefer stability, warmth, and demonstrated capacity for nurturing relationships over financial resources." "I can change," Marcus insisted, surprising himself with the conviction that rang in his voice. "I am changing. These children are bringing out parts of me I thought died with Sarah. Can you really change, though? Because if you're pursuing this custody arrangement as some kind of grief response or attempt to resurrect your relationship with Sarah through her look-alike nieces—" "Don't," Marcus interrupted, his voice taking on that dangerous edge that had intimidated boardrooms full of corporate sharks. "Don't psychoanalyze my motives, Catherine. Just tell me what I need to do to keep my family together." Meanwhile, Detective Ray Collins had been quietly conducting his own investigation into the girl's background at Marcus's request. What his research uncovered sent chills of recognition down Marcus's spine and changed everything he thought he understood about fate and coincidence. The girl's mother, Linda Hartwell, had died in a car accident exactly 6 months ago during a thunderstorm remarkably similar to the one that had claimed Sarah's life. Their father, David Hartwell, had struggled with alcoholism and depression following his wife's death before ultimately abandoning his daughters shortly after her funeral, leaving them to fend for themselves on the unforgiving streets of Manhattan. But it was Linda's maiden name in the official records that stopped Marcus's heart completely: Brennan. The same surname as his beloved Sarah Brennan, the woman whose memory had haunted him for a decade. "Catherine," Marcus called his attorney with hands that shook so violently he could barely hold his phone steady. "I need you to research something immediately. Look into the Brennan family genealogy, specifically any connection between Sarah Brennan and Linda Brennan Hartwell." 3 tension-filled hours later, Catherine called back with news that would fundamentally alter everything Marcus thought he knew about destiny, coincidence, and second chances. "Marcus, sit down before I tell you this," she began ominously. "Linda Brennan Hartwell was Sarah's younger sister. These girls, they're Sarah's biological nieces. Emma and Sophie are your deceased girlfriend's family." The room seemed to tilt around Marcus as the full implications crashed over him like a tsunami of revelation. Sophie's uncanny resemblance to Sarah, her impossible knowledge of the music box melody, her ability to see Sarah's presence in his dreams, it all suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. These weren't just random children he'd rescued from the street. They were Sarah's flesh and blood, carrying her genetic legacy and somehow, inexplicably, her spiritual connection to him. That evening he approached the subject with Emma as gently as possible, not wanting to traumatize her with difficult family history she might not be ready to process. "Emma, did your mother ever mention having an older sister named Sarah?" he asked carefully. Emma's expressive green eyes immediately filled with tears that she tried bravely to blink away. "Mama used to cry sometimes when she looked at old photo albums, and she'd talk about Aunt Sarah. She said Sarah died in a terrible accident before Sophie and I were born, but that she was the most beautiful and kindest person in the whole world. Mama always said that Aunt Sarah watched over us from heaven, and Sophie always claimed she could feel her presence during thunderstorms." "Why didn't you tell me about this connection when you first learned my name?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Because Mama made us promise never to tell strangers about our family history," Emma explained with the wisdom of a child forced to grow up too quickly. "She said some people might try to use our connections against us, or might pretend to care about us just because of who we were related to, instead of who we really are." As Marcus tucked both girls into bed that night, Sophie looked up at him with those piercing, otherworldly green eyes that now held even more significance than he'd originally understood. "You loved her more than anything in the whole world," she said softly, and it wasn't a question. "Yes," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I did love her that much." "She knows," Sophie replied with absolute certainty, "and she forgives you for whatever you think you did wrong the night she died. She wants you to forgive yourself too, so you can love us the way we need to be loved." But as Marcus returned to his study and stared at Sarah's photograph with this devastating new understanding, he realized that the girl's blood connection to his lost love was simultaneously the greatest blessing and the most dangerous curse imaginable. Because now he would have to face the complete truth about that horrific night 10 years ago, and confront the guilt-ridden secret he'd carried in his heart every single day since Sarah's death. The custody hearing loomed like an execution date, scheduled for Monday morning at 9 sharp, and Marcus knew with brutal clarity that he was fighting what appeared to be a losing battle against an entrenched system. Despite his considerable wealth, political connections, and access to the city's most expensive legal representation, the family court system traditionally favored stable, conventional families over single businessmen with reputations for ruthless ambition and emotional detachment. "We desperately need character witnesses," Catherine insisted during what felt like their 100th preparation meeting, her usually confident demeanor showing cracks of concern. "People who can testify convincingly to your capacity for compassion, your ability to prioritize these children's needs over your business interests. Without that human element, we're just asking the judge to trust that someone known for corporate ruthlessness can suddenly become a nurturing father figure." Marcus almost laughed at the bitter irony. In his relentless pursuit of building a financial empire over the past decade, he had systematically burned more professional bridges than he'd constructed, alienating potential allies through calculated coldness and strategic indifference. The few people who might have been willing to speak favorably about his character were either too intimidated by his fearsome reputation or simply didn't know the man who existed behind his carefully constructed corporate facade. That evening, as he sat on the floor helping Sophie work on a 1,000-piece puzzle featuring a pastoral landscape that seemed impossibly peaceful compared to their current circumstances, she made one of her characteristic observations that cut straight through his defenses to the raw truth beneath. "You're scared they'll take Emma and me away because deep down you still think you don't deserve to be happy," she said with matter-of-fact certainty, not even looking up from the puzzle piece she was examining. "But that's not what Aunt Sarah thinks. She says you've punished yourself long enough for something that was never your fault to begin with." Marcus set down his own puzzle piece, his hands beginning to tremble uncontrollably. "What exactly do you know about that night, Sophie?" The 7-year-old turned those impossibly perceptive green eyes toward him, and for a moment he felt like she could see directly into his soul, reading every secret he'd tried to bury. "I know you were supposed to pick her up from her job at the art gallery that night, but your business partner made you stay late for a really important meeting with investors who were only in town for 1 day," she recited with eerie accuracy. "I know Aunt Sarah understood about work being important, so she took a taxi instead of making you choose. I know it was raining very, very hard, and the taxi driver was being extra careful, but the other driver ran straight through the red light because he was texting his girlfriend and didn't even see the intersection." Every single word was like a perfectly aimed knife to Marcus's chest, exposing the guilt he'd carried like a lead weight for 10 agonizing years. The self-blame that had consumed him, the bitter conviction that if he'd simply left that meeting and prioritized Sarah over business, she would still be alive today. "I know you replay that night over and over, wondering what would have happened if you'd made different choices," Sophie continued with impossible gentleness. "But Aunt Sarah wants you to understand that some things in life can't be changed or controlled, only accepted. She never blamed you, not even for 1 second." Emma had stopped pretending to work on her homework to listen intently, her eyes wide with growing understanding of the tragic history that connected them all. "Is that why you're so afraid to love people? Because you think you'll lose them too, and it will hurt even worse than losing Aunt Sarah?" For the first time in 10 years, Marcus felt tears threatening to overflow, his carefully maintained emotional walls crumbling under the gentle assault of these 2 extraordinary children who somehow understood his pain better than any adult ever had. "The judge tomorrow," Marcus said quietly, his voice thick with suppressed emotion. "She's going to ask me directly why I want to keep you, what makes me think I can be the parent you deserve." "What will you tell her?" Emma asked with the gravity of someone far older than her 7 years. Marcus looked at both girls, Emma with her fierce protectiveness and hard-earned wisdom, Sophie with her ethereal insight and supernatural connection to the aunt she'd never met in life, and realized the answer had been there all along, waiting for him to find the courage to speak it aloud. "I'll tell her the absolute truth," he said finally. "That you saved me from drowning in my own guilt and grief, that you taught me it's possible to love again without betraying the memory of someone I lost, that you made me remember who I used to be before I built walls around my heart." Babe, but as both girls finally went to sleep that night, Marcus remained awake in his study, staring at Sarah's photograph, and knowing that tomorrow he would have to strip away every protective barrier he'd constructed and bare his wounded soul to complete strangers. The terrifying question that kept him awake until dawn was whether 10 years of building impenetrable walls around his heart would prove too formidable to overcome in the span of a single morning in family court. The fate of 3 hearts hung in the balance, and for the first time in his adult life, Marcus Wellington had no control over the outcome. The family courthouse felt like a cathedral of judgment, its high ceilings and imposing oak panels designed to intimidate rather than comfort. Marcus sat at the defendant's table in his best navy suit, But for the first time in his career, expensive tailoring couldn't armor him against the vulnerability of having his personal life dissected by strangers. Judge Elizabeth Hartman was a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair and penetrating brown eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail for future evaluation. She had a reputation for being tough but fair, which Catherine assured him was their best possible outcome. "Mr. Wellington," the judge began, reviewing the case file with obvious skepticism, "you're asking this court to grant custody of two minor children despite having no previous parenting experience, no stable family structure, and a professional reputation that suggests you prioritize business over personal relationships. Help me understand why this arrangement would serve the children's best interests." Marcus stood, his legs steadier than he'd expected. "Your Honor, 6 months ago I would have agreed with your assessment. I was exactly the kind of man you've described, cold, calculating, emotionally unavailable. But Emma and Sophie changed everything." "How so?" Judge Hartman's tone remained neutral, professional. "They taught me that success without love is just expensive loneliness. They showed me that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the foundation of real strength. They helped me understand that some things matter more than profit margins and market shares." Janet Morrison, the social worker, rose to present her opposing argument. "Your Honor, Mr. Wellington's recent emotional awakening, while admirable, doesn't erase a decade of documented behavior. These children need stability, not a guardian working through his own psychological issues." "I object to that characterization," Catherine interjected. "Mr. Wellington has demonstrated consistent care and protection of these children for weeks now. But the damage was already done." Marcus could see doubt creeping into Judge Hartman's expression. Then Emma stood up from her seat in the gallery, her small voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "Your Honor, may I say something?" The judge paused, clearly surprised by the interruption. "This is highly irregular, but—" "Yes, child. What would you like to tell me?" Emma walked forward with dignity beyond her 7 years. "Marcus isn't perfect, but he's the first grown-up who ever kept a promise to us. He said he wouldn't let anyone separate Sophie and me, and he meant it. He reads us stories every night, even when he's tired from work. He learned how to braid hair because Sophie likes fancy braids. He's teaching us that love doesn't always leave." Judge Hartman's expression softened slightly, but Janet Morrison wasn't finished. "Your Honor, there's another matter. Our investigation discovered that these children may have unusual psychological conditions that require specialized care." Marcus felt ice form in his veins. They'd found out about Sophie's gift. "What kind of conditions?" the judge asked. "The younger child, Sophie, exhibits signs of what psychologists call hypervigilance with paranormal attribution. She claims to communicate with deceased relatives and demonstrates concerning detachment from reality." "That's not true." Emma's voice cracked with desperation. "Sophie isn't crazy. She just sees things other people can't see." Sophie had been silent throughout the proceedings, but now she stood and walked directly to Judge Hartman's bench with that eerie confidence that always unsettled adults. "Your Honor," Sophie said in her clear, matter-of-fact voice, "your daughter Rebecca died in a car accident 3 years ago. She was 28 and had just gotten engaged. You blame yourself because you advised her to take the highway instead of city streets to avoid traffic." The courtroom fell dead silent. Judge Hartman's face went white as sheet, her hands trembling as she gripped her gavel. "How could you possibly know that?" she whispered. "She's here with us right now," Sophie replied gently. "She says to tell you that the other driver fell asleep at the wheel. It wasn't your fault, and she needs you to stop punishing yourself." Marcus watched in stunned amazement as the powerful judge began to cry, her professional composure completely shattered by a 7-year-old's impossible knowledge. But Janet Morrison looked triumphant. Your Honor, this clearly demonstrates the child's need for psychiatric intervention. Judge Hartman called for a 30-minute recess, but Marcus knew their fate was sealed. Sophie's gift had just destroyed their chances of staying together. During the recess, Marcus found himself in the courthouse hallway, feeling more helpless than he'd ever experienced in any boardroom negotiation. Catherine paced frantically while making urgent phone calls, but her body language suggested she was fighting a losing battle. "We need a miracle," she admitted quietly. Sophie's demonstration in there, while remarkable, plays directly into their argument that she needs psychiatric care. Emma sat beside Sophie on a wooden bench, both girls understanding that their future hung in the balance. Sophie seemed unusually subdued, as if she finally grasped that her special ability might be the very thing that separated them from the only stable home they'd known. "I'm sorry," Sophie whispered to Marcus, tears finally streaming down her pale cheeks. "I just wanted to help the judge understand. I didn't mean to make things worse." Marcus knelt in front of her, taking her small hands in his. "Sophie, you have nothing to apologize for. You have an extraordinary gift, and I won't let anyone convince you that it's something to be ashamed of." "But they think I'm broken," Sophie said, her voice breaking on the last word. "You're not broken," Marcus said firmly. "You're special in ways most people can't understand, and that's exactly why Emma and I need to protect you." That's when Dr. Rebecca Chen appeared in the hallway, slightly out of breath from rushing across the city. Behind her were 3 other people Marcus didn't recognize. "Marcus, I'm sorry I'm late," Rebecca said, her usually calm demeanor showing signs of urgency. "But I brought some friends who insisted on coming." Dudi, the first person, stepped forward. An elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun. "Mr. Wellington, I'm Dr. Margaret Thornfield, Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Columbia University. Dr. Chen called me about Sophie's abilities." The second person was a middle-aged man in a priest's collar. "Father Thomas McKenna," he introduced himself. "I've studied cases of spiritual sensitivity in children for 30 years. The third was a surprise. Detective Ray Collins, the investigator Marcus had hired to research the girl's background. "Dr. Chen told us what happened in there," Dr. Thornfield explained. "Mr. Wellington, what your daughter demonstrated isn't mental illness. It's what we call heightened intuitive perception. I've documented dozens of similar cases, particularly in children who've experienced trauma." "Sophie isn't delusional," Father McKenna added gently. "She's demonstrating what many cultures throughout history have recognized as spiritual gifts. With proper guidance, children like Sophie grow up to be healers, counselors, and bridges between the physical and spiritual worlds." Detective Collins stepped forward with a thick folder. "Marcus, there's something else. My investigation into the girl's parents uncovered something interesting about their father, David Hartwell." "What kind of something?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. "He didn't just abandon them after Linda died. He's been searching for them ever since, but he's been in rehab getting clean. He completed the program last week and has been working with social services to find his daughters." Marcus felt the floor drop from beneath him. Just when he thought he might have a chance at keeping his makeshift family together, the girl's biological father had returned to claim them. "Where is he now?" Marcus asked quietly. "He's here," Detective Collins replied grimly. "He just walked into the courthouse." Through the hallway window, Marcus could see a thin man with haunted eyes and the girl's distinctive blonde hair approaching the building's entrance. Emma followed his gaze and gasped. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice filled with a complex mixture of hope, fear, and betrayal. Sophie turned to look, then grabbed Marcus's hand with surprising strength. "He's not ready yet," she said with that unsettling certainty. "His heart is still too broken to take care of anybody, including himself." But ready or not, David Hartwell was about to walk back into his daughters' lives, and Marcus realized that fighting the state for custody had been nothing compared to the battle he was about to face against a biological parent with legal rights. The recess was ending, and when court resumed, everything would change once again. David Hartwell looked like a man who'd aged 20 years in 6 months. His once strong frame was gaunt from grief and addiction recovery. His blonde hair streaked with premature grey, and his green eyes, so achingly familiar in Emma and Sophie's faces, held the hollow look of someone who'd lost everything that mattered. When he entered the courtroom, both girls pressed closer to Marcus, their small bodies tense with conflicting emotions. Emma's face showed recognition mixed with hurt and confusion, while Sophie studied her father with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see straight into people's souls. "Daddy looks sick," Sophie whispered to Marcus, her voice carrying more sadness than any 7-year-old should possess. Judge Hartman resumed the session with obvious reluctance, the earlier revelation about her own daughter still weighing heavily on her composed demeanor. "Mr. Hartwell, I understand you're petitioning for the return of your biological children." David stood unsteadily, his voice cracking with emotion when he spoke. "Your Honor, I know I failed them. After Linda died, I fell apart. I started drinking to numb the pain, and when that wasn't enough, I just ran away. I told myself they'd be better off without me, but I was wrong. They're all I have left of Linda, and I've been sober for 63 days. I'm ready to be their father again." "Mr. Hartwell," Judge Hartman said gently, "recovery is admirable, but these children have been through tremendous trauma. They need stability and consistency." "I can provide that," David insisted, though his trembling hands belied his words. "I've got a job lined up, and a small apartment in Queens. I know it's not fancy like what Mr. Wellington can offer, but they're my daughters." Marcus felt his heart breaking as he watched Emma struggle with emotions too complex for a child to process. She loved her father, but she'd also been abandoned by him when she needed him most. Now she faced an impossible choice between the security Marcus offered and loyalty to her biological parent. "Emma, Sophie," Judge Hartman addressed the girls directly, "this is your father. How do you feel about returning to live with him?" Emma stood slowly, her small frame radiating the dignity she'd developed through hardship. "Your Honor, I love my daddy, but—" Her voice broke, and she looked directly at David with tears streaming down her face. "You left us, Daddy. We were scared and hungry and sleeping in doorways, and you were gone." David began to cry, his shoulders shaking with the weight of his failures. "I'm sorry, baby girl. I was sick, but I'm better now. Please give me another chance." Sophie approached her father with that otherworldly calm that always preceded her most profound observations. She studied his face for a long moment before speaking. "Daddy, you're not really better yet," she said with gentle honesty. "You stopped drinking, but you haven't forgiven yourself for leaving us. You haven't forgiven yourself for not being able to save Mama. Until you do that, you can't take care of us because you can't take care of yourself." The courtroom fell silent as Sophie's words hung in the air like a diagnosis delivered by the most compassionate doctor imaginable. David stared at his younger daughter, recognizing truths he wasn't ready to face. "But I love you," he whispered brokenly. "I know you do," Sophie replied, reaching up to touch his cheek with infinite tenderness. "And we love you too, but love isn't enough if you're not healthy enough to show it safely." Dr. Thornfield stood up from the gallery. "Your Honor, may I suggest a compromise? Mr. Hartwell clearly needs more time to complete his emotional recovery. Perhaps supervised visits while the children remain in Mr. Wellington's care, with the goal of eventual reunification when Mr. Hartwell demonstrates sustained stability." Judge Hartman considered this carefully. "Mr. Wellington, would you be willing to facilitate a gradual transition that allows Mr. Hartwell to rebuild his relationship with his daughters?" Marcus looked at Emma and Sophie, seeing in their faces the hope for a solution that didn't require them to choose between the father they loved and the security they desperately needed. "Of course," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Family isn't about ownership, it's about love and protection. These girls deserve to have both their father and their stability." But as David Hartwell agreed to the supervised visitation arrangement, Sophie turned to Marcus with that unsettling perception that always preceded her most disturbing revelations. "There's something else coming," she whispered, so quietly only he could hear. "Something about Aunt Sarah that's going to change everything." Marcus felt a chill of premonition, wondering what other secrets from the past were about to surface in this already complicated situation. 3 weeks into the new arrangement, David's supervised visits with Emma and Sophie had been progressing slowly but positively. Marcus had hired Dr. Thornfield as a family therapist to guide the healing process, and gradually the broken father was beginning to reconnect with his daughters while working through his own trauma and guilt. But Sophie had been growing increasingly restless, her nighttime dreams filled with visions she couldn't quite articulate. She would wake up calling for Aunt Sarah with an urgency that left Marcus deeply unsettled. "She's trying to tell me something important," Sophie explained one morning over breakfast, her green eyes distant and troubled. "But it's like she's talking through water, and I can only catch pieces of what she's saying." Dee. That afternoon, while Emma was at her therapy session with Dr. Thornfield, Sophie disappeared from the penthouse. Marcus found her in the lobby, standing in front of the building directory with that focused intensity he'd learned to respect and fear. "Sophie, what are you doing down here?" "We need to go to the place where Aunt Sarah worked," she said with absolute certainty. "She's been trying to show me something about the night she died, but I need to see it with my real eyes, not just my dream eyes." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. The Meridian Art Gallery, where Sarah had worked, was only 6 blocks away, but he hadn't set foot near it since her funeral 10 years ago. "Sophie, I don't think that's a good idea. That place holds very painful memories for me." "I know it hurts," Sophie said gently, taking his hand with surprising strength. "But Aunt Sarah says the truth will heal the hurt, not make it worse. She says you need to know what really happened that night." Against every instinct screaming at him to avoid that emotional battlefield, Marcus found himself walking through the city streets with Sophie toward the gallery that had been Sarah's second home. The building looked exactly the same, a converted brownstone with large windows displaying contemporary paintings and sculptures. The current owner, Vincent Castellano, recognized Marcus immediately despite the passage of years. "Mr. Wellington, my God, I haven't seen you since the funeral. What brings you here?" This is Sophie," Marcus said, his voice strained with emotion. "She's Sarah's niece, and she has some questions about the night Sarah died." Vincent's expression grew somber. "Of course. Sarah was extraordinary. One of the most talented curators we ever had. Her death was such a senseless tragedy." Sophie studied Vincent with that penetrating gaze that made adults uncomfortable. "You feel guilty about something," she observed matter-of-factly. "Something about that night that you never told anybody." Vincent's face went pale. "I don't know what you mean, sweetheart." "Yes, you do," Sophie continued with gentle relentlessness. "You asked Aunt Sarah to stay late that night to finish something important, something that couldn't wait until the next day. And you've been feeling bad about it ever since because you think if she'd left on time, she wouldn't have been in that taxi when the accident happened." Marcus stared at Vincent, pieces of a puzzle he'd never known existed suddenly clicking into place. "Vincent, is that true?" Vincent's hands began to tremble. "Marcus, I'm so sorry. I never told you because I knew you'd blame me. And honestly, I blame myself enough for both of us. We'd just acquired a Monet, a private sale that had to be authenticated and catalogued that same night for insurance purposes. Sarah volunteered to stay late because she was the only one with the expertise to handle it properly. "So she wasn't just working late because of my meeting," Marcus whispered, his world tilting on its axis. "She had her own professional obligations that night. The timing was just horrible coincidence," Vincent continued, tears streaming down his face. "If she'd left at her normal time, if I hadn't asked her to stay, if the authentication could have waited until morning, I've replayed it 1,000 times." Sophie looked up at Marcus with eyes that held infinite compassion. "Do you understand now? It wasn't your meeting that kept Aunt Sarah out late. It wasn't your choice that put her in that taxi. It wasn't anybody's fault except the man who was texting while driving. You've been carrying guilt that was never yours to carry." The emotional weight Marcus had shouldered for 10 years suddenly lifted, leaving him feeling dizzy and disoriented. All this time, he'd constructed his entire identity around the false belief that his business priorities had killed the woman he loved. But Sophie wasn't finished with her revelations. "There's more," she said quietly. "Aunt Sarah wants you to know why she really took that taxi that night, instead of waiting for you to finish your meeting and pick her up like you'd planned." Marcus knelt beside her, hardly daring to breathe. "Why?" Sophie smiled with the wisdom of someone far older than her 7 years. "Because she found out that morning that she was pregnant, and she wanted to get home early to plan how to surprise you with the news. She was going to tell you that night that you were going to be a daddy." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow, stealing his breath and bringing him to his knees right there on the gallery floor. Sarah had been carrying their child, a future he'd never known existed, stolen away in an instant of random tragedy. As Vincent helped him to his feet and Sophie wrapped her small arms around his waist, Marcus realized that this 7-year-old girl hadn't just given him back his innocence. She'd given him back the future he'd thought was lost forever. The weeks following Sophie's devastating revelation had transformed Marcus in ways that surprised everyone who knew him. The crushing guilt that had driven his ruthless business persona for a decade had been replaced by something lighter, but more purposeful. A determination to honor Sarah's memory by building the loving family she'd never gotten the chance to create with him. David Hartwell's recovery had accelerated dramatically during this period as well. The supervised visits with his daughters had evolved into overnight stays, and Dr. Thornfield reported remarkable progress in his therapy sessions. The broken man who'd walked into that courtroom was gradually being replaced by the loving father, Emma, and Sophie remembered from before their mother's death. "He's getting stronger every week," Emma confided to Marcus during one of their evening talks. "Sophie says his heart is healing, which means he'll be ready to take care of us soon." Marcus felt a complex mixture of pride and impending loss. He'd fought so hard to keep these girls in his life, but watching their relationship with their father slowly rebuild itself was perhaps the most beautiful thing he'd ever witnessed. "Are you ready for that transition?" Marcus asked gently. "Are you prepared to go home with your father?" Emma considered this seriously, her 7-year-old mind grappling with emotions most adults never had to face. "I think so, but Marcus, will you still be our family even if we don't live here anymore?" "Always," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Family isn't about where you sleep at night, it's about who you carry in your heart. You and Sophie will always be my daughters, no matter what." Sophie had been quieter than usual, spending hours at her bedroom window with the music box, humming Sarah's melody and having conversations with someone only she could see. When Marcus asked about these extended sessions, she'd simply say that Aunt Sarah was helping her prepare for something important. The final custody hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, exactly 3 months after that first life-changing encounter in the rain. Judge Hartman would make the ultimate decision about whether David had demonstrated sufficient stability to regain full custody of his daughters. Catherine Hayes had prepared Marcus for the likely outcome. David's completed his recovery program. He's maintained sobriety for 4 months, he's got stable employment and housing, and most importantly, he's rebuilt trust with Emma and Sophie. Unless something dramatic changes, he's going to get his daughters back. "I know," Marcus replied, and found that he genuinely meant it. It's the right outcome. They belong with their father. That Sunday evening, as David tucked the girls into bed at Marcus's penthouse for what might be the final time, Sophie made an announcement that surprised everyone. "Tomorrow in court, I'm going to tell the judge something very important," she said with that matter-of-fact certainty that had become her trademark. "Something that will make sure everyone gets exactly what they need." "What kind of something?" David asked, sitting on the edge of her bed. Sophie smiled mysteriously. "It's a secret that Aunt Sarah finally figured out how to share. She says it's time for all the broken pieces to come together into something beautiful." Marcus felt a familiar chill of anticipation. Sophie's pronouncements always preceded significant life changes, and he'd learned to trust her otherworldly insights, even when they frightened him. "Sophie," he said carefully, "whatever you're planning to share tomorrow, are you sure it's safe? Are you sure it won't cause more problems than it solves?" Sophie looked at him with those impossibly wise green eyes that held depths far beyond her years. "Marcus, sometimes the scariest truths are the ones that set everyone free. Tomorrow, we're all going to understand why everything happened exactly the way it was supposed to." As Marcus turned off the lights and wished everyone good night, he couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie's final revelation would change their lives in ways none of them could possibly anticipate. The little girl who claimed to speak with angels was preparing to deliver one last message that would determine the fate of 3 hearts seeking healing, forgiveness, and the courage to embrace an uncertain but hopeful future. Tomorrow would bring either the end of their unconventional family or the beginning of something entirely new. The courthouse felt different this time. Gone was the adversarial tension that had characterized their previous appearances, replaced by something that felt almost ceremonial, as if they were all gathered to witness the conclusion of a story that had been written long before any of them understood their roles in it. Judge Hartman entered with the measured dignity befitting this final hearing, but Marcus noticed something softer in her demeanor since Sophie's revelation about her deceased daughter. The hard edges of judicial skepticism had been smoothed by the impossible gift of a 7-year-old's compassion. David Hartwell sat straighter than he had in months, his recovery evident in clearer eyes and steadier hands. Dr. Thornfield had submitted glowing reports about his progress, documenting not just sobriety, but genuine emotional healing and restored capacity for responsible parenting. "This court has reviewed Mr. Hartwell's progress over the past 3 months, Judge Hartman began formally. "The reports indicate substantial improvement in his physical health, emotional stability, and parental capabilities. Mr. Wellington, you've facilitated this transition admirably, putting the children's needs above your own desires." Marcus nodded, though his heart felt like it was being slowly torn in half. He'd always known this day would come, but understanding intellectually that Emma and Sophie would return to their father couldn't ease the approaching grief of losing his makeshift family. "However," Judge Hartman continued, "before I render my final decision, I understand that Sophie has something important to share with the court. Sophie, would you please approach the bench?" Sophie stood with that otherworldly composure that never failed to unsettle adults, walking forward in her best blue dress with the music box clutched carefully in her small hands. She moved with purpose, as if she'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her dreams. "Your Honor," Sophie began in her clear, confident voice. "Before I tell you what Aunt Sarah wants everyone to know, I need to ask Mr. Vincent from the art gallery to bring something very important." The courtroom fell silent as Vincent Castellano rose from his seat in the gallery, carrying a manila envelope that he approached the bench with obvious reverence. "What is that, Mr. Castellano?" Judge Hartman inquired. "Your Honor, after Sophie's visit to the gallery last month, I remembered something Sarah had entrusted to me shortly before her death. She'd asked me to keep this sealed letter in our safe, to be opened only if something ever happened to her sister, Linda." Marcus felt the world tilt around him as Sophie took the envelope and held it with the solemnity of someone handling sacred relics. "Aunt Sarah knew that Mama had a weak heart," Sophie explained to the hushed courtroom. "The doctors said Mama might not live to see Emma and me grow up. So Aunt Sarah wrote a letter about what should happen to us if Mama went to heaven first." With small but steady fingers, Sophie opened the envelope and removed several pages of Sarah's familiar handwriting. Marcus recognized her careful script immediately, the same writing that had filled love notes and grocery lists during their time together. "Would you like me to read it?" Sophie asked Judge Hartman with mature courtesy. "Please do, sweetheart." Sophie's voice carried clearly through the silent courtroom as she read her aunt's words from beyond the grave. "If someone is reading this letter, it means Linda is gone, and I'm not there to help care for Emma and Sophie. My heart breaks knowing I won't be there to protect them, but I've thought carefully about what would be best for my precious nieces. David is a good father, but I know his struggles with depression and drinking. If Linda dies, I'm afraid he might not be strong enough to care for the girls alone, at least not immediately. He'll need time to heal and get the help he requires. Marcus Wellington is the love of my life, and though we haven't had children together yet, I see how he loves me completely, protectively, forever. I know he would extend that same devotion to Linda's daughters if they ever needed him. I'm writing this letter to formally express my wish that if anything happens to Linda and if David is unable to care for the girls, Marcus should become their guardian. Not to replace their father, but to provide stability while David heals. I believe with all my heart that Marcus and David could work together to give Emma and Sophie the family they deserve, combining David's biological love with Marcus's resources and protective strength. The girls would have two fathers instead of losing one. Love multiplies when shared, it doesn't divide. The letter was signed and dated just 2 weeks before Sarah's death, witnessed and notarized with legal precision. Sophie looked up at Judge Hartman with those penetrating green eyes that seemed to hold cosmic wisdom. Aunt Sarah wants everyone to understand that this was never about choosing between Daddy and Marcus. It was about creating a bigger family so Emma and I would never be alone again, no matter what happened. Judge Hartman studied the letter carefully, her legal mind processing the implications. This is unprecedented. Ms. Brennan is essentially recommending shared guardianship between the biological father and her romantic partner. "Oh, not shared guardianship," Sophie corrected gently. "Shared family. Daddy would be our daddy, and Marcus would be our daddy too, just in different ways, like how some kids have grandparents and parents and aunts and uncles all loving them at the same time." David Hartwell had been silent throughout Sophie's revelation, but now he stood with tears streaming down his face. "Marcus, I owe you everything. You saved my daughters when I couldn't save myself. You helped me become the father they deserve again. If Sarah believed we could raise them together, I can't think of anyone I'd rather share that honor with." Marcus felt a dam burst inside his chest, releasing 10 years of grief, guilt, and carefully guarded hope. Sarah hadn't just forgiven him from beyond the grave. She'd engineered a future where her death would ultimately create more love, not less. "Your Honor," he said, his voice thick with emotion, I would be honored to help David raise these extraordinary girls, not as competition, but as family. Judge Hartman smiled, genuinely smiled, for the first time since Marcus had met her. This court hereby grants primary custody to David Hartwell, with Marcus Wellington designated as legal co-guardian and secondary custodial parent. The girls will spend weekdays with their father and weekends with Marcus, with both men sharing responsibility for their education, health care, and emotional well-being. Emma began crying with relief, while Sophie simply nodded, as if this outcome had been inevitable all along. "There's one more thing," Sophie announced, approaching Marcus with the music box. "Aunt Sarah says this belongs in your apartment, so her Melody can watch over all of us wherever we are." As the courtroom cleared and the paperwork was signed, Marcus realized that Sarah's greatest gift hadn't been the love they'd shared during her lifetime. It had been her wisdom in creating a path forward that transformed tragedy into hope, loss into abundance, and broken hearts into an unconventional but perfect family. That evening, as David tucked Emma into her bed in their Queen's apartment and Marcus read Sophie a bedtime story at his penthouse, the music box played Sarah's Melody in both homes simultaneously, a gentle reminder that love transcends time, space, and even death itself. Some families are born. Others are forged through fire, loss, and the courage to believe that love multiplies when shared rather than hoarded. Marcus Wellington had learned the most important lesson of his life from two small girls with green eyes and infinite hearts, that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the most devastating losses, and that second chances aren't just about starting over, they're about discovering who you were always meant to become. In the end, Sophie had been right about everything. Love really was worth the risk of losing it, because true love never really dies. It just transforms into new possibilities, new families, and new reasons to believe in tomorrow.